David Hume's skepticism leaves us in an uncertain and frankly unsettling place. He convincingly argues against induction and shows why our certainty regarding causality is not rational. According to Hume, we are creatures that operate purely on habit and assumption. We assume the future will be like the past, and this assumption underlies all of our inductive, scientific, causal reasoning. For more information on this, I would highly recommend watching my previous videos on David Hume. The information there is important background for the content here, because this is a follow-up, but it's not necessary. At the end of his scathing, ceaseless attacks on our beliefs, Hume acknowledges that while our belief in causality may not be certain, it is still nonetheless extremely useful in our lives. Nearly all of our thinking employs some form of causal reasoning, so abandoning it altogether means abandoning life itself. So, he offers an alternative. Why not define cause and effect more specifically to reflect things we actually have experience of? Why not define causation in a way that is epistemologically consistent? Similar objects are always conjoined with similar. Of this we have experience. Suitably to this experience, therefore, we may define a cause to be an object, followed by another, and where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. Or, in other words, where, if the first object had not been, the second had never existed. This definition actually consists of two definitions, which Hume insists are equivalent. The first is, a cause is the first thing, and the effect is the second, if all things like the first were previously followed by the second. Someone with a consistent nut allergy, who sneezes every time they eat one, would call the nut the cause and the sneeze the effect, because the first has always been followed by the second. The second sub-definition, which Hume thinks is merely a restatement of the first, is, if the first thing had never happened, the second thing also never would have happened. An example of this is, if the man hadn't eaten the nut the most recent time, he never would have sneezed. The second definition asks you to imagine what might have happened if you changed the causal variable. Both of these definitions capture our intuitive understanding of causation in a reasonably satisfying way. If you asked me on the street what properties a cause should have, I would probably say something similar. It should always be conjoined with its effect, and if it didn't happen, neither would the effect. But as I alluded to at the end of my last video, this notion of causation has serious problems. Let's critically evaluate this definition and go through the issues one by one. The first problem is relatively minor, and I think, charitably, that it's just a minor wording problem. Notice how Hume says, similar objects are always conjoined with similar. Of this we have experience. The issue with this is that we can't, as part of our limited, finite experience, possibly see that similar objects are always conjoined with similar objects. We can only say that it has been a consistent part of our experience to this point in time. This slight rephrasing is certainly more consistent with Hume's very skeptical empirical stance, where we learn every single thing from sensory input. The way he phrased it sounds more like the common sense, unskeptical version of causality he was trying to avoid, where we think we see true causation that always holds necessarily. Still, a relatively minor issue. In a similar vein, let's move on to the next. Hume says that the two definitions outlined here are the same. The cause and the effect have always been conjoined, and if the cause hadn't been, neither would the effect. It seems reasonable enough, but the problem lies in the fact that these are not the same definition, and one of these sub-definitions is completely incompatible with Hume's empiricist program. The first one is okay, and is what Hume had been discussing this whole time. It is entirely informed by previous experience. One thing has always been followed by another, so we call one the cause and the other the effect. But the second definition, which Hume insists is the same, is not actually so. If the first had never been, then the second wouldn't either. The first hint that this is entirely different from the first definition is that it is conditional on something that we never observe, while the first is conditional on what we do observe. The second definition appeals to a situation in which something we observed happening didn't actually happen. Like, we see the man eating a nut and then sneezing, and we then imagine that if he hadn't eaten that nut, he wouldn't have sneezed. This is qualitatively different from the first definition. One always followed by another doesn't equal if the first hadn't been, then the second wouldn't have either, because the first definition appeals to the past, and the second definition appeals to a possible world that we don't have access to. Well, if the issue is just that these two definitions aren't actually equivalent, then maybe Hume should have just said that a cause and effect situation needs to fulfill both of these criteria. This is intuitive enough, but as I said before, there is a deeper problem. Remember how I said that Hume's proposed formulation of causality is supposed to be epistemological, not ontological? It's supposed to be a statement purely based on what we have observed, rather than any kind of metaphysical insight, because we have no such metaphysical insight, and we learn everything from experience. Well, the second definition, as we just stated, appeals to a possible world where something we did observe factually in the past never did truly happen. In other words, it is based in counterfactual logic, in something outside of experience, counter to the facts. So his causation definition explicitly appeals to something of which we have no experience. So basically, Hume attempts to smuggle in true metaphysical causation to his skeptical epistemological definition. What basis would we ever have to claim that if the first object had not been, the second would never have existed unless we knew somehow that the necessary connection was there, which Hume insists is fundamentally beyond our reach? The issue here, and the whole argument Hume had made up until this point, is that we think in this necessary causal way, but we don't know that it is this way. This definition is supposed to be defined in light of what we actually have access to, that being repeated instances of similarities. Thing 1 has always been followed by thing 2. We don't see the necessary connection, just regularities. So appealing to the imagined scenario of thing 1's non-existence causing thing 2's non-existence is a relic of a non-skeptical epistemology of causation, the exact thing Hume was trying to fight against. So his appeal to the possible, hypothetical world is polluted by unskeptical epistemology and metaphysics, as was his verbiage that we talked about before this. Unfortunately, this issue is actually further complicated with the fact that Hume, while going against his own skeptical epistemology with this kind of appeal to the counterfactual, clearly understood how important the idea is. Counterfactual logic, the unobserved, actually plays a massive role in modern causal inference by informing how we think about causal questions. Randomized control trials, for example, are designed by trying to approximate counterfactual logic in an observable setting. The idea is that, obviously we can't say factually what would have happened if person A at time t both took and didn't take drug D. But if we find a person who is very similar to person A, called person B, we think we can just actualize the scenario where they take drug D and where they don't, and then measure the effect of drug D. Suffice it to say for now, that Hume likely knew the importance of the counterfactual definition, mistakenly believed it to be equivalent to the first definition, and didn't recognize how much it went against his work, at least in the form in which he stated everything in his book. It probably just shouldn't have been utilized by Hume as his direct definition of empirical, epistemological causality, perhaps more as a litmus test, or useful heuristic. Aside from this admittedly great difficulty, there are further problems that are more specific to the definition itself and not its consistency with his overarching system. For one, there are many things that science recognizes as causal that wouldn't be admitted by Hume's definition. We say smoking causes lung cancer, or an unhealthy diet causes heart disease, but these aren't fully regular. Some people smoke and never get cancer. Some people eat unhealthily and never get heart disease, while some people don't smoke and get lung cancer, and some people eat healthily and still get heart disease. Hume's notion of causation is too singular. It only admits relationships where one thing follows another thing every single time, and doesn't acknowledge complex relationships where different thresholds and combinations will be at play. Another issue is that his definition seems to admit causal relationships in which we are otherwise sure there is no causal relationship. Consider the same man who sneezes after eating nuts. Let's say that he also believes in a very strict religion where he must, without fail, pray before he eats, because if he eats without prayer even once, he will be condemned to hell. So he prays, he eats, and his food is then digested. Unfortunately, under Hume's definition of a cause, the man's prayer actually fits as a cause of his food digesting. Every time he digests food, he prayed, and if he hadn't prayed, he wouldn't have digested food because he wouldn't have eaten. But we would never call the prayer the cause of the food's digestion. This example seems to show that Hume's definition doesn't discriminate between sequential events and preconditions and causes. There's a difference between a background precondition and a cause in the way Hume uses it. The definition needs to be narrower. I should also note here that for the probabilistic world of quantum mechanics, Hume's notion of causality seems to fall apart even further. But I'm no expert on this, so that's all I will mention about that. There's enough misinformation about quantum stuff going around, and I'd rather not contribute even more to it. In my last video, user Christos3080 left an extremely thought-provoking comment that gets at another difficulty with Hume's definition. While their comment, I think, contains many rich insights, the main one I draw from it is that if we think of a cause and effect scenario, such as pushing a box with our hand, this seems like a relatively simple interaction. However, Christos3080 points out that what is really going on is in fact an extremely complex and specific interaction involving our hand atoms pushing on box atoms pushing on other box atoms, floor atoms resisting the box atoms, etc. As I see it, this exact scenario involving this exact configuration of atoms and energies and whatnot will, to the likeliest of probabilities, never ever happen again. And thus, there won't ever be repeated instances of causal scenarios for us to observe. Thus, many things we think will fulfill Hume's causal definition just simply won't. One may protest and say that we don't have direct experience of atomic interactions, we just have the box and the hand, but this is a weak point because we collectively have sensory confirmation of these things, and thus they really should be considered. Basically, causal interactions that we usually see as repeatable are revealed to be completely unrepeatable and astronomically complex at a granular level. Since Hume insists on repeatability between similar scenarios, this makes it hard to ascertain whether anything can truly fit as causal. Perhaps we could try to establish some similarity threshold, but this would unfortunately always be arbitrary and definitely not grounded in experience. Another unfortunate problem is that it seems to allow for spurious correlations, or confounded variables to be mistaken as causal. For instance, say every time I go outside in the heat, I take a very cold glass of water with me. Very soon, the glass of water begins to exhibit external condensation. Following this, I will begin to sweat. In this scenario, this has happened every time I go outside, and if the glass didn't have condensation, neither did I sweat. So technically, according to Hume's definition, the glass condensation is causing me to sweat. But this is something that we would never recognize as causal because it is recognized by everybody that it's actually the outside heat and environment that is causing both events, one after the other, and Hume's definition doesn't allow us to distinguish this. His definition doesn't capture the way in which, epistemologically, we still do our best to hypothesize and discriminate between proposed causal mechanisms. We may not be able to see the necessary connection between events, know that God wrote the universal code in such a way, but we can make falsifiable predictions and test hypotheses, and say that between multiple things which fit Hume's criteria, only one of them will be called the cause. A scientist would look at the situation and correctly determine that the heat is causing both, not the glass condensation causing my sweating, and this is where people like Karl Popper try to posit their own ideas about the scientific method. There are likely other objections that I am unable to think of currently, and there is a direct Kantian response that warrants its own video, but I want to discuss one final objection to Hume's analysis of causality that comes from the speculative materialist, or naturalist sect of philosophy, specifically from thinkers Ray Brassier and Quentin Meillassoux. In Nihil, Unbound, when discussing Meillassoux and Hume, Brassier echoes my own summary of Hume when he says this. More specifically, Hume's critique of induction casts doubt upon the verifiability of scientific theory, for it is logically impossible to conclusively verify a universal proposition by reference to experience. Though there is no good reason why we should find one outcome more inherently plausible than another, Our belief in causality encourages us to assume that the actually observed outcome is somehow necessary, while all the other conceivable outcomes are merely contingent logical chimeras. And since neither experience nor reason provides grounds for this apparent necessity, Hume relocates it in relation to phenomena. The story that Brassier and Meillassoux tell is the same as what I said in this video and the last one. We find causality not in noumena, or the things in themselves, but in how the world uniformly and consistently appears to us, is known by us. In other words, Hume offers an epistemological account of causation, just as we said before. But for these philosophers, this is an issue. They think that Hume accurately outlines an attack, but is unwilling to accept the necessary conclusion from his own argument, that causation, and more broadly, necessary relations, do not exist. Though Hume demonstrates that our belief that one outcome is more necessary than another is grounded in nothing more than habit, and though he insists that the existence of uniformity cannot be demonstrated by experience or reason, he nevertheless refuses to deny its existence altogether. Hume is effectively insisting that the appearance of uniformity is uncircumventable. Moreover, since Hume's empiricism rules out any appeal to noumena, sensibility providing our only access to reality, his claim that habit generates the appearance of uniformity is tantamount to claiming that uniformity inheres in the structure of phenomena, phenomena being the only reality there is. Accordingly, Hume never calls into question the reality of uniformity. He merely denies that we could ever know the reason for it. Hume continues to assume that there is a reason why one thing happens rather than another, that there is a reason why the world is thus and so rather than some other way. This critique is complex and is constructed from multiple lines of argument, not all of which I agree with. They critique Hume for not going far enough and denying causation altogether, alleging that he implicitly assumes causation and necessity still exist, even if they're beyond rational demonstration. It is true that Hume does not altogether deny causation, and certainly supports causation's existence as something likely real but not provable, like when he says, "None but a fool or madman will ever pretend to dispute the authority of experience." Hume implies causation as something he knows exists, but can't prove that it does. It actually is a weakness of Hume's that he doesn't go further in his questioning. Occasionally, he will give mention to the apparent irrefutability of hardline skepticism, the sort which would outright deny causation. He gives some credence to this brand of skepticism, but denies its practical efficacy. For Hume, the denial of causation and other uniform phenomena is something that a thinker can have fun with in isolation, but must immediately abandon when they enter the real world. You can deny all you want that a car hitting you would 100% cause you to die while sitting in a chair, pondering, but you wouldn't be thinking the same way when crossing the road. So, for Hume, his implicit support of causation, or of the acceptance of the uniformity of nature, is more of a practical precept that is founded on a recognition that while causation may be unprovable, it sure seems to be true. So Brassier and Meillassoux hit on something important here, that for all of Hume's skepticism, he really didn't go far enough in questioning causality. And if we consider the problems outlined earlier, where his supposedly skeptical epistemological definition of cause still contained seeds of unskeptical causation, it seems even more damning that Hume was less skeptical than he claimed to be. But should Hume have denied its existence? In Brassier's words, though he insists that the existence of uniformity cannot be demonstrated by experience or reason, he nevertheless refuses to deny its existence altogether. If Hume couldn't explain it rationally, should he then deny necessity's existence? Now, this is an extremely complicated question, and really gets at the heart of every issue of knowledge and reality. Every single atom of experience seems to indicate to us that something like necessary causality exists. We can't strictly prove that the uniformity is always universally true, or true in the exact same way, because the only reason we have to believe that it won't change is that it hasn't previously changed, which is a circular argument. For me, the issue is, if we explicitly deny causality and necessity exist, rather than subsisting in, at the very least, a kind of agnosticism with implicit acknowledgement, we then have to explain what else might be going on behind the scenes that generates this consistency. As already mentioned, Kant has its own answer, which I definitely won't get into here, but Brassier and Meillassoux' answer is particularly illuminating and relevant. Rather than causality and necessity, they embrace radical contingency, which can interrupt the flux of becoming with the same arbitrary capriciousness as it can scramble the fixity of being. Absolute time is tantamount to a HyperChaos, for which nothing is impossible, unless it be the production of a necessary being. It is a contingency which usurps every possible order, including the order of disorder, or the constancy of inconstancy. The world in itself, what Hume would probably say guarantees those necessary causal connections, of which we can't be sure, for Meillassoux is one in which there are definitely no necessary causal connections. There can be causation one moment and chaos the next. It doesn't imply that everything must change all the time, for then change would be the rule and would be necessary. For Meillassoux, nothing is necessary. It could be like our world, that order reigns for a very, very long time. It's just that there's no universal code block ensuring that it always stays that way. It could always change. In a way, this instantiates the skepticism regarding the assumption of resemblance. We think the future will be like the past. Hume shows us this is not guaranteed at all epistemologically, but maintains implicit support for the idea. Meillassoux says that it is definitely not true. Even beyond our minds, there is no guarantee of causal consistency or necessity. Assuming necessary causal connections always hold is simply too strong of an assumption, so Meillassoux embraces this chaotic view instead. Brassier ends up rejecting Meillassoux' philosophy for a reason I both agree with and plan to make a video on someday, but for now we can say he roughly accepts it. To me, I think saying Hume should reject necessary causal connections is too strong. In a truly skeptical epistemology, the HyperChaos of Meillassoux and the implicit causation of Hume are both statements about the in itself, to which we have no true access. Really, they should both be held in limbo because neither are ever provable. Meillassoux correctly identifies Hume's error, but goes too far in his rejection of Hume. We can't say that causality exists, but crucially, we also can't say that it doesn't exist. Meillassoux being so definite that there is absolutely no necessity is also faced with an explanatory issue. If there is no guarantee of consistency, why is it that we have experienced it so far? It's a question that, honestly, I don't think has an answer. For this reason, even though Hume kind of practically and implicitly upholds causation, which everybody does, even Meillassoux and Brassier, whether they like it or not, I doubt Meillassoux wakes up thinking that everything he thinks he knows might change, but regardless, Hume still did a fantastic job at distancing himself from strong metaphysical claims. He mostly managed to doubt without denying. Of course he flinched when faced with an outright rejection of causation, because rejecting that means rejecting experience, and experience is quite literally all we have. This isn't to say that Hume's errors should be overlooked. His notion of causation and empirical system generally have been commented on, rejected, reinvigorated, and debated for centuries. The flaws I point out, I think, shouldn't be seen as marks on Hume's record, but areas for further investigation and theoretical refinement. Thank you so much for watching. That last section got a little bit dense, as it tends to do with these speculative materialists, but we got through it. If you haven't, I would highly suggest watching my previous two videos on David Hume. They inform a lot of the background information for this video, and would help any viewer get more depth from this extremely rich topic. If Brassier seems interesting, my video, The Existential Challenge of AI, covers his philosophy briefly. He and Meillassoux will continue to feature in my videos. Also, subscribe to my channel if you like videos like this. I always try to provide theoretically rich and insightful videos as consistently as possible. I also have an interest in horror fiction, which both features in my videos occasionally and informs the argumentative angles I take. If that sounds good, again, a subscription will be well worth your time. Like the video if you enjoyed it, it helps a lot, and please comment your thoughts on the arguments here. The discussion from the last video was truly fascinating. Finally, please, have a nice day.